Hello, um, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Olga Rarikovsky, and I am the Programs, Partners, and Engagement Manager here at the Vilna Shul, Boston Center for Jewish Culture. The Vilna, located on historic Boston Beacon Hill, is the last remaining immigrant-era synagogue building in Boston and now serves as a center for Jewish engagement. We offer opportunities to connect and explore one's culture, experience the arts, and engage in big ideas for Boston's Jewish community. We are thrilled to have Laura Leibman join us tonight to discuss her book, Once We Were Slaves. Before we get started, I wanted to clarify a few housekeeping rules. First, this program will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel tomorrow. Second, if you have a question, please enter it into the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom webinar screen, as we will leave time for Q&A at the end of the discussion. And lastly, all participants will be muted, and the program should last about 60 minutes. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Laura Leibman.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share a screen. People who've met me before will know that I'm very interested in images. So if for some reason you can't see the images, definitely let me know, as I think they'll help the presentation. My story tonight starts not in the 18th century where it might belong, but rather at this first half of the 20th century on the lower side, on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, with a woman named Blanche Moses. And as World War II was just about to start, Blanche found herself writing to the rabbi in charge of American Jewish Historical Society. And she was very concerned because her collection of her most prized possessions, her daguerreotypes, had been lost. And she was desperate for the rabbi to go out and find them, what had happened to them at the Historical Society, because they were so important to her sense of family. Now, this collection of daguerreotypes was important to Blanche, in part because it included many of her family members, but it was also important to the Historical Society because Blanche didn't come from just any family. Rather, she was somebody who came from one of the most illustrious families in early America. And she needed the rabbi's help because, as she noted, I could be reached at any hour, day, or evening, as I do not go out. Something which always seemed funnier to me before the pandemic began, and now which I just empathize with Blanche all the time for all the days we all were trapped inside. So the Historical Society was interested in the daguerreotypes in part because on both sides of her family, Blanche was related to some of the most important people in the early United States, particularly in early New York. On her father's side, she was related to a man named Isaac Moses, who was one of the financiers of the American Revolution and was lauded as one of the early presidents of Congregation Shearith Israel. On her mother's side, she was related to Rabbi Gershom Mendes Seixas, or Hazan Gershom Mendes Seixas, the most beloved leader of early Congregation Shearith Israel and Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia. So she really had this incredible, illustrious history. Blanche, it turns out, not only had these great legacies, but was a huge proponent of genealogy. And she did a remarkable job of not only creating her own family history, but of sending notes correcting other people's sense of her history, not only to the Historical Society, but also to the early New York Times. But in spite of all that proficiency with genealogy, when it came to her grandmother's line, she was stuck and unable to go forward. She knew that her grandmother, Sarah Brandon Moses, had a father who was from Barbados, Abraham Rodriguez Brandon. And Abraham Rodriguez Brandon was the wealthiest Jew on the island of Barbados by the end of his life. And she also knew that Sarah Brandon had a brother, Isaac Lopez Brandon, who had also come to New York at a relatively young age. But when it came to who the siblings' mother was, she was stuck. And we can see in her own notes that she says, Abraham Rodriguez Brandon, Barbados, married Sarah Esther, question mark? And it turns out she wasn't alone in having problems trying to figure out how to trace this part of her line and not understanding why she couldn't find the legacy of Sarah and Isaac's mother. Even the most famous genealogist of early American Judaism from her time period, Malcolm Stern, also had the same problem where he couldn't figure out who was the wife of Abraham Rodriguez Brandon. And it turned out that both of them hypothesized that it was this woman, Sarah Esther Lopez, but they were wrong about a key thing. And this was at the heart of the reason why they couldn't figure out their family's genealogy. And that was they assumed that Sarah Esther Lopez gained the last name Lopez because she was born into the family of the Lopezes on the island of Barbados. But instead, Sarah Esther had gained the name because she was born enslaved to the Lopezes, as were her two children. Tonight, I'm going to tell you that story of how it was that Sarah and Isaac went from being born poor, Christian, and enslaved on the island of Barbados to, by the end of their lives, being some of the wealthiest Jews in New York. But I'm also going to get at why it was that their story got lost by future generations, what had changed in American history that made it so incomprehensible to Blanche that her ancestors might have been born enslaved. Through the course of their story, I'm hoping that you'll come away this evening with three main things. The first one is I hope you'll learn something just about Sarah and Isaac, because I think they're a great example of how sometimes people who aren't particularly famous during their own lifetimes are nonetheless fascinating to later generations. Second, I hope that through their story, you'll learn something about the nexus of Jews and race during this really key time period in American Jewish history at the end of the 18th century and the early part of the 19th century. And through that history, I hope you'll get at the sense of how Jews' understanding of race and issues with race differed in some key ways from other people that they lived in and amongst. And in particular, usually stories similar to Sarah and Isaac's would be told under the guise of passing. And some of you may have even seen the recent film of that title that was done by Netflix based on Nella Larsen's novel. Passing, however, assumes that people could go to a new place and leave behind their past to keep it from the gaze of other people. And that just wasn't possible for Sarah and Isaac, because every single place that they went around the Atlantic world, there were people from the Barbadian Jewish community who knew that they had begun their lives enslaved and that they had African ancestors. Nonetheless, their race changed as they moved around the Atlantic world. So I really want to get at how is it that that happened in spite of that knowledge being present everywhere they went. The third item that I hope you'll take away from tonight's presentation is something about the larger history of multiracial Jews in the United States. Some of you may have known about recent surveys of American Jews that highlight the diversity of Jews today. And I'm hoping through Sarah and Isaac's story, you'll get a sense that that's not something that's only happening in recent American history, but rather has a much longer history that many of us may have been aware of. So with no further ado, I want to take us forward to the place where Sarah and Isaac were born in the southeastern part of the Caribbean on the island of Barbados. Sarah and Isaac, as I mentioned, had this father named Abraham Rodriguez Brandon, and he was born free and Sephardic. The woman that he had a relationship with, however, Sarah Esther Gill, or sometimes Sarah Esther Lopez, unfortunately for me, when her father died, he left a note saying she went by multiple names, really a gold mine for historians when you find that sort of thing, was born really in opposite circumstances, that she also lived in the Sephardic community, but is somebody completely impoverished and unable to shape many of the aspects of her destiny. That pair had not just one child, Sarah, but also a son named Isaac, who was 6 years older than Sarah was. In addition, it looks that they had about 2 other children who died during their childhood. Those siblings and their mother grew up not on one of the plantations that was owned by Abraham Rodriguez Brandon along the western part of the island, but rather in the main port of Bridgetown. And this is the city where most Jews on the island lived. And they lived along this street called Swan Street, or if you could somehow see beneath it, it says, or Jew Street. And that's because many of the Jews lived along this key market street that was located right next to the Nida Israel Synagogue. That congregation was the home not only to the siblings' father, but also to the Sephardic family that enslaved them, the Lopezes. And at various points in his life, their father was not only on the synagogue governance board, but also was the Parnas, or president of the congregation. So he's really central to island Jewish life. Well, the family that enslaved them was also part of this community. They were nowhere near as wealthy as the siblings' father. Instead, they lived along this merchant street where families typically had a store downstairs and then would live in a small apartment above it. And indeed, this particular family, the Lopezes, had not one but two stores along Swan Street. One was a gold or silversmith shop, and the other was a kind of all goods purpose store where people would buy their food for the week as well as items of cloth to create clothing and all those sorts of daily needs that people have. Despite having been born in and among this Sephardic family, the siblings' mother, after Sarah was born, took her to the local church in order to have her birth registered. And at the time that she took her there, she also had Sarah baptized. This was necessary because if she wanted her daughter's birth recognized, she couldn't go to the synagogue because the siblings' mother, along with their grandmother and great-grandmother all the way back to Africa, were not considered halakhically Jewish by the local Jewish community. And on the island, it was very rare for there to be conversions to Judaism. So if she wanted to have any place write down the siblings' births, she needed to go to the local church. At that church, by taking her to get baptized, Sarah and Isaac's mother was really doing something important for her daughter. And that was, she was laying the groundwork that if one day Sarah wanted to get married legally, she would be able to do so. And this was really a privilege that most enslaved people did not have. In fact, it was something that was not an opportunity available to either Sarah and Isaac's mother or their grandmother or great-grandmother. So she's really trying to look into the future and see opportunities for her daughter. At the same time, submitting her daughter to the church meant that the church recorded not only her daughter's name in baptism, but also her daughter's race. And they marked down that she was a person of color. And had Sarah stayed on the island for the rest of her life, that racial designation would have followed her until her death. It was not something that in Barbados ever could have changed. So as the children were growing up, they were living in and among Swan Street like many of the people on the island who were born enslaved and lived in urban situations. But suddenly in 1801, when Sarah was only 3 years old, their situation changed dramatically, and that change would set them apart from most other slaves in the city. The first thing that set their destinies apart was that their mother's father, who was a white Anglican man, died, and he left his property, including a house, not to his white relations, but rather to his family by a woman of color. And this really was extremely unusual in Barbados. It wasn't against the law, but it was something that would not happen by default and was very rare. So suddenly in 1801, the siblings' mother went from being somebody who was considered a piece of property herself to being somebody who owned property. And that was really something that would help the siblings get a leg up going forward. The location of the house that they inherited was also key. The house was located along Hartley's Alley near Back Church Street, and that was near the old churchyard where very shortly after they inherited the property would be built St. Mary's Church. And this was the key church where elite free people of color attended. And in this sense, owning that house also allowed them into this inner circle of free people of color in and around Bridgetown. The house, however, was also located near where another church would soon be built, and that was the island's Methodist Church. And it's here that the strategies that I used for writing this history became super, super important. Very early on, I was really interested in making sure that I wasn't just tracing their father's Jewish line, but that I was also tracing their mother's heritage as well. And doing so turned out to pay off dramatically. And that was because through their mother, the siblings were related to the most famous woman in early Barbadian history, the first female national hero on the island. And that was a woman who, after her death, was called Sarah Ann Gill, but during her own lifetime was called Anne Jordan Gill. And she was married to one of the siblings' mother's brothers. So their aunt is this incredibly famous heroine of early Barbados who used the Methodist Church in order to argue for and gain civil rights for both free and enslaved people of color. And this ended up being really helpful to me because Isaac later would also become involved in civil rights struggles in the island of Barbados, but he would use Judaism in order to try and gain civil rights for people. So seeing that larger context of how their mother's family was weighing in and influencing them was really, really helpful. So just to go over the genealogy really quickly before I move on, because it's a little complicated, here's Sarah Brandon, here's her brother Isaac, here's the two sisters who passed away as children, here's their mother, Sarah Esther, and their father, Abraham Rodriguez Brandon. Through one of Sarah Esther's brothers, they're related to this very famous early national hero of Barbados. And again, through my research, I was able to trace not only who their grandmother was, a woman named Jemima Lopez, but also their great-grandmother, a woman named Deborah Lopez. And Deborah, Jemima, Sarah Esther, all three of her brothers, and all of these children were born enslaved or were enslaved by the Lopez family in Bridgetown. So that was the first huge thing that happened to the family. They went from people who were utterly forced to be dependent upon other people to people who had opportunities and a house of their own. The second huge thing that happened was that their father stepped up and decided to make sure that the siblings would be free for the rest of their lives. And in order to do this, he took the siblings back to St. Michael's Church and had them manumitted. In order to do that, he needed to pay off not only the Lopez family so that he would be allowed to free them, but also the church in order to finalize legally the manumission. And through this process, he was guaranteeing not only that Sarah and Isaac would be free, but all of Sarah's descendants would also be born free. So just a monumental shift in the opportunities that they would have, as well as all of Sarah's descendants going forward. I think it's really important to note this is so unusual for this time period. It's very rare that somebody actually manumits enslaved people. They often were people who they were related to, as in this case, but the vast majority of people living in and around Bridgetown and across the island who were enslaved would have to wait until 1834 with general emancipation. So that means that Isaac, had he been like everybody else, would have been well into his 40s by the time that he became free, as opposed to living a full life as a free person. And similarly, Sarah would have been old enough that she would have had all of her children born enslaved as opposed to free. So, with those two key changes in 1801, the siblings then began to live out the rest of their childhood, again, in and around Swan Street, partaking in the free people of color community, often that had ties to either the Anglican or the Methodist Church, but many of whom who also had kin who went to the Nida Israel Synagogue. And they probably would have continued that way for the rest of their lives if it weren't for another remarkable thing that happened when Isaac was quite young in 1811. And that was he decided he was tired of living at the margins of the synagogue and he wanted to be halakhically, that is legally considered Jewish. So Isaac decided in 1811 to leave the island of Barbados and to travel south to the colony of Suriname, where he would legally convert to Judaism. So today, many of us probably wouldn't travel to Suriname to convert to Judaism, so it's probably worth saying something about why. Why did they choose Suriname? And here, there's a couple things to keep in mind. One is, during this time period, Suriname, along with this little peanut-shaped island off the coast of Venezuela, called Curacao, were the two biggest Jewish communities in the Americas. So really key places that almost anybody would want to go to in order to convert if they lived in this region. And you'll notice that they're about equal distance from the island of Barbados. The thing that probably weighed Suriname in the siblings' choice, however, is that Suriname, unlike Curacao, had the largest multiracial Jewish community in all of the Americas. So it was a place that was much more welcoming to people with African ancestry who wanted to be part of the Jewish people or who were already part of the Jewish people. So in 1811, the siblings landed in Suriname, and they landed in the main port. But the reasons for that diverse community really lay downriver in an area called Yoden Savannah, or Jew Savannah. And that was a town that was set up in the early part of, or the middle part of the 17th century, and was a semi-autonomous Jewish community. That particular community really had aspirations to build a new Jerusalem. So we find that they put their synagogue on the highest part of the high part of the town, just like you were supposed to according to Jewish law. And they also tried to follow aspects of the Torah that were related to enslaving people, including some of the laws about circumcising and converting enslaved peoples, particularly if those people happen to have a Sephardic or Jewish father. So not everybody was being converted in the town, but people who had some kin ties to the Jewish community were more likely to be converted. And this meant by the time that the siblings arrived in Suriname, one scholar has estimated that probably over half of the community had at least one African ancestor. So a very, very diverse community, even by today's standard. So by the time they arrived in 1811, that community had sort of fallen into some disrepair. So the siblings instead landed upriver at this main port of Paramaribo. And Paramaribo was a bustling town in addition to having this large Jewish community. It had beautiful houses along the waterfront, some of which were mansions owned by wealthy Jews, other were houses owned by the Jewish community where poor Jews could live. And in addition, it had not one, but two synagogues. And when the siblings decided to convert then, they had a choice of where they wanted to go. And they chose the Portuguese or Sephardic synagogue. That choice was very important, we'll see, in terms of what they were able to do with their lives in the Jewish community. So some of you today may have seen the interior of this particular synagogue. It's now in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. But I'm going to go back for a second. But I think it's worth having some sense of why would they want to choose the Sephardic community? And perhaps the most obvious reason is their father was a Portuguese Jew, so it made sense to turn to the Portuguese Jewish community. But it's also worth noting that during this time period, and I'm sure for some people today as well, that the Portuguese community was considered the pinnacle of Jews. So they were much more, had much more social status. So by joining this community, they're really sort of getting a leg up in terms of their opportunities within Jewish life. So after reaching out to the Ma'amad and getting permission to be circumcised as an adult, both Isaac, who had to undergo the circumcision, and his sister, who obviously didn't, were allowed to undergo the rites of conversion, which involved, in addition to other things, going to the small building behind the synagogue, opening up the little trap door, and underneath was a ritual bath where they, one by one, would have gone down and immersed. At the time, it would have been filled with beautiful water. It's all dried today. And then would have come back up the stairs, halakhically Jewish. And I often get asked, would people have felt like this was a good conversion? I think in part because people don't, again, think of Suriname as this huge Jewish community that it was at the time. And the answer is yes. This was the kind of conversion that was not questioned throughout the Atlantic world, unlike conversions, for example, that happened in Philadelphia or New York, which often would be discounted when people got back to London. So a very clearly counting kind of conversion ceremony. I mentioned that there was one other synagogue where they could have converted at, and that was the Ashkenazi synagogue. And this is where I think some of the nuances of how Jews saw each other in the colonial period are important. As I mentioned, if you had a choice about being Sephardic, colonial Jews would almost always choose to be Sephardic. We see examples of this in early statesmen. Mordecai Emanuel Noah, 3 of his grandparents are Ashkenazi, but if anybody asks him, he's Sephardic. So again, it's something that people would aspire to. And we see some of that distance between the communities going on in terms of the policies within the Paramaribo community, such that if somebody from that Portuguese community married a woman from the Ashkenazi community, he would then be demoted by his own community and not have as high a status as he had before. So a real attempt to keep some sort of social distance, in spite of the fact that that's completely contrary to Jewish law. So we really see a distancing going on. In addition, in both of these congregations, there was discrimination against the people who were considered Jews of color. And this is where knowing something about how race worked in Suriname is incredibly helpful. So I had mentioned in Barbados, if you were born and somebody who was considered a person of color, that race would follow you for your entire life and could not be changed. Not so for everybody in Suriname. So you'll remember there was that half of the community that might have had an African ancestor, but not all of them were considered people of color. If you were somebody who had 7 out of your 8 great-grandparents being European, you might either be white or a person of color. If your parents were married, you would be white. If your parents were unmarried, you'd be a person of color. And if they married after you were born, your race would change and you would be redesignated as being white. So again, we see some of that kind of movement that wasn't possible in Barbados. Because of this, we actually have a fair amount of people who are white in the eyes of the colonial government and the synagogue who do have African ancestors nonetheless. But those people were very engaged in the local race-making practices of the colony, of using marriage in order to make those kinds of distinctions. And we find them adapting some of the Jewish rituals in order to keep up with what's going on with understandings of race around them. And one of the key places we see that is through marriage contracts. So again, this is completely contrary to Jewish law, but one of the things that happens in the marriage contracts in the colonies is we see them inserting racial information about the people so they know who is a Jew of color and who's not, who is somebody who's considered white. And they do that in a really interesting way. Many of the colonial Jewish documents will talk about people of African ancestry as being Cushites or some other term from the Bible, but not so in the marriage contracts. In the marriage contracts, they instead refer to people as emancipated Jews, meaning they or one of their ancestors used to be enslaved. And so they're not saying they're not Jewish, they're not saying they're not another race, but they are this kind of second class member of the Jewish community because of that legacy of slavery. And again, this is something that would haunt the person who is designated that way, as well as potentially their children. And that's because people who were deemed to be Jews of color were forced to sit in the second class seats in the synagogue, would be buried in the swampy part of the cemetery, could not be called up to the Torah to be given honors or to read, and they couldn't vote in any of the synagogue elections in order to change those policies. So we really see them being given the second class status within the congregation. And I think it's that second class status, that way of both including people through conversion, but also distancing them, that may help us understand why, after they converted, Sarah and Isaac didn't decide to stay in Suriname. It's really important to note that the Jews of color who were experiencing this discrimination did not take it lightly, and in fact fought back against a lot of these policies. And one of the key ways that they did that was by creating their own brotherhood called Darhei Yeshurim, which was located just around the corner from the European-led synagogues. That brotherhood was a place where Jews of color would have full privileges and would be allowed to experience Judaism as complete members of the community. But over time, the members of Darhei Yeshurim decided they would also like to hold religious services and be not just a brotherhood, but also a proper synagogue. And that's when the European-led congregations clamped down on Darhei Yeshurim and tried to have it disbanded. So we see the members of Darhei Yeshurim petitioning the local secular government, trying to point out that it's illegal that they're discriminated against in these ways. But nonetheless, by the time that the siblings have arrived in Suriname, that congregation has been forced to be disbanded by the local government, and all the people who belong to the congregation have rejoined the European-led congregations. So I think, again, this helps us understand some of why it was that following her conversion, the siblings decided not to stay in Suriname, despite all of the opportunities that it offered. And we find shortly after the conversion that Isaac travels back to Barbados, where he also becomes involved in some of the civil rights disputes on the island, particularly involved in the disputes about whether Jews should have the right to vote. I'm not going to talk a lot about that dispute now, but I talk more about it in the book at length, and I'm happy to answer questions about it in the question and answer period. So Isaac goes back to the island, but his sister decides to keep traveling on. So remember, she's several years younger. She's not finished with her schooling, and her father decides to pay for her to go to London, where she is drawn not only by the much, much larger Jewish community, a Portuguese community, which is centered around Synagogue Bevis Marks, but also is drawn there by the opportunity to join a Sephardic school. So this is not just a regular kind of Talmud Torah. This is a really fancy, elite Sephardic boarding school where Sarah would have rubbed shoulders with people like the Montefiores, and she would have learned how to become a leader in the Sephardic community in the Atlantic world. It was a place where Sarah would have learned how to navigate the languages that were crucial to Western Sephardic Jews, including Spanish and Portuguese and Hebrew that were used in the synagogue services, as well as she would have learned how to give charity to people, as was so important for elite British women during this time period, as opposed to being the kind of person who was given charity by people. She would have also learned how it was that she was going to navigate an entire household of people who were serving her as opposed to being a servant herself. And in this sense, I think it's really important to recognize how this education at this boarding school, almost as much as her conversion itself, is allowing her to become part of that elite Sephardic world that she'll be part of by the time that she dies. While she's at this boarding school, she also has her little portrait made. And it shows up big on the screen, but these miniatures are only about this big. They're about 2 3/4 inches tall by 2 1/4 inches wide. And they're made out of incredibly rare materials. So made out of very thinly cut ivory, which is painted with watercolors. And these are the sorts of things that are so expensive that they cost as much to make as one of the large full-size portraits that would have been popular during this time period. But in spite of that expense, these small ivory miniatures remain tremendously important for Jews in the Atlantic world. And part of that reason has to do with the ways in which these particular portraits are associated with whiteness during this time period, a time period where Jews and race are suddenly becoming a little bit more complicated. So we see here that here's an artist. This is actually a miniature in and of itself, a miniature depicting a miniature maker making a miniature. But we also see how the woman that he's creating in the miniature is supposed to echo the ideals of classical sculpture, including that incredibly white luminescent skin that would have in the originals been marble, but here is being used or created by ivory instead. So again, they create this effect of that kind of luminescence, that glowing magical whiteness through creating these very thinly shaved pieces of ivory, which would then be burnished with an iron so that you get this warm glow coming through. And we can see some of that warm glow that we get from the ivory in the detail of the portrait of Sarah's brother Isaac, where you can see parts of it don't even have paint on it. It's just the ivory showing through. One of the things that I became very interested in with Sarah's miniature was the style in which it was made. And this sort of gets back to the details of ivory. So ivory, while having this wonderful glow, also has some problems with it for painters, which are that in order to get the paint to stick, you either have to make these little dots like we see right here, or these kind of hash marks, which are typically used for hair or background or clothing, something that you want texture for. But I was really intrigued with how differently the strategies used for Sarah's miniature were than that of other multiracial women from this time period. So here we see a miniature of an early multiracial woman from the same time period from Suriname and one from early New York. And I hope you see that the miniature maker here has done exactly what you're not supposed to do in order to create variations in skin tone. And that is he's used that hatching technique, the little lines. And you'll see pretty clearly that this gives the women an odd appearance. It makes them look all scratchy in ways that are presumably nothing to do with how the women actually looked, but rather is helping us see how the miniature maker was viewing the women himself. So we're seeing the painter's bias coming through in the way he's misusing the paint in order to create these portraits. And I was really interested in how that's very typical for multiracial women during this time period, but not something that happens in Sarah's portrait. Rather, Sarah's portrait in many, many ways is designed to show her ability to move into this white sphere and her participation in it. So we can see some of that participation in the white sphere also in the way that Sarah is being dressed in it, that she's really wearing a type of gown, which I think for many of us who watch too much Jane Austen films seems like, oh, that's just how people dress during this time period, but is actually quite particular to the various years that she's looking at. So you'll notice that she's wearing this emperor waisted gown, very white, something that emphasizes I am not a person who ever needs to do any work. at all, because her gown would have been ruined almost instantly. So very much a statement about her relationship to labor, and something that somebody born enslaved would almost never be able to wear. It also emphasizes her relationship to freedom in some other interesting ways, though. It's a style of gown that was particularly associated with the Empress Josephine, the wife of the Emperor Napoleon, who was advocating for Jewish freedoms, but is very different, you can see, from other gowns of this type worn by Jewish women in the North or by the Empress, in that Sarah's is much more modest. It has a much higher neck than we associate with the year in which it was made. And part of that has to do, I think, with her West Indian legacy and the issues of race. For the women who are in France or in the North, they're showing their command of their body through the way that they dress. But Sarah is too, because in the West Indies, there were often rules that kept women, that enforced women with certain amounts of African ancestry to not be able to cover their chest. So really, by covering herself up, Sarah's showing she is a person of higher status and racial privilege that is able to keep her body for herself. So with this portrait in hand, Sarah went back up a little bit farther north to the center of London, to that historic synagogue, Bevis Marks. And it was there that her portrait miniature met another miniature, this one by a gentleman named Joshua Moses, who was in London on business from New York. Now, like Sarah, Joshua Moses was the son of a great merchant. So Sarah's father was the wealthiest Jewish merchant in Barbados. Joshua's father was Isaac Moses, the wealthiest Jewish merchant in New York. So there's a real way in which this is a marriage also between the fathers-in-law as much as it is between Joshua and Sarah. And we definitely see that in terms of how much interest Abraham Rodriguez Brandon has in this marriage. He not only attests during the ceremony to Sarah's Jewishness, so thereby ensuring that she will be able to be married in the synagogue, but also attests that he will give a 10,000 pound dowry to Sarah, which is a huge amount of money. It's about $30 million worth of purchasing money in today's economy. So just a phenomenally large amount of money to put down on his daughter for her to be this incredible heiress, somebody who Joshua Moses would be thrilled to marry. There's also a way in which, though, the story is changed remarkably by Sarah having come to London. So you'll remember that had she stayed in Barbados, her race wouldn't have ever been able to change. Had she stayed in Suriname, she would have been considered this second-class member of the congregation if her parents never married, which they didn't. But when she comes to London, that's put aside. And what's noted instead in her marriage contract is that she, like her father, is a member of the Nassau, the Portuguese Jewish nation. And so now, no longer is the ketubah have that concern that it had in Suriname of marking her as an emancipated Jew. That's not something they do in London. All that's important is that she's actually genetically part of the Portuguese nation, and the rest of her legacy drops out of the picture as this incredible heiress. So shortly after their marriage, the couple settle in quite close to Bevis Marks, at a building that was close to the wharves where Joshua worked. But before the year is out, Sarah is pregnant with her first child, and they decide to leave London and to go where they already have family. And they travel back not to the island of Barbados, but instead to New York, where Joshua's family lives. And they settle in on the lower end of Manhattan, close to, so I'm going to go back a little bit, close to the Sherith Israel Synagogue and close to the house where Joshua's parents live. This is the house where Sarah and Joshua are living. And within a few short years, they're joined by Sarah's brother Isaac, who becomes not only business partners with her husband, but also marries Joshua's sister. So they live right next door to each other, and they're very closely connected in terms of both business and family ties. At the same time, their mother comes north as well and also settles right along one of these fancy streets near the synagogue and near her children. And really, here we see again how important the Portuguese aspect of their conversion is and their genealogy, as well as that ability to travel. Because had the siblings landed in a different US city, their destinies might have been quite different because race was understood differently in different states during the first part of the 19th century. So had they gone to New Orleans, they might have still been considered people of color. But here in New York, in spite of large amounts of racism, not only in the city, but even amongst some people in the Jewish community, Isaac is allowed to become a full voting member of the congregation, something which he had just lost when he was in Barbados during those civil rights disputes. And through his connections with the Moses family, they stand up for him and testify that he should become a naturalized citizen of the United States, something which was denied to people of color during this time period. So in both the census and in the US government's mind and in the eyes of the synagogue, they are seen as Jews, not seen as people with African ancestry. And again, very importantly, this is not because people don't know about their past. In fact, both Joshua, Moses, and other members of the synagogue board had gone to the Talmud Torah at Shearith Israel with the grandchildren of Sarah and Isaac's former enslaver. So it's common knowledge within the community about their ancestry, but nevertheless, the community sees them as Jewish and as Portuguese Jews, as opposed to seeing them as people that they considered people of color. So while they're here, I go through in the book all the kind of trials and tribulations they have after they get to New York, including talking about some of the sort of touch and go moments as they're dealing with various pandemics that are running through New York during this time period. And finally, look at what comes of those marriages. And for Sarah, by the time she reaches 30, she has passed away, but not before she's had not one, but 10 children, which, and 9 of whom who live to adulthood. She has 2 sets of twins, and her children benefit from that mobility that she had, as well as that incredible wealth of the family. So her children become mainstays of the New York Jewish community. Her only daughter, Raina, is one of the wealthy women who takes on the job of teaching at the synagogue school in the 1830s. Another one of her sons helps start the Jewish hospital in New York and is both a Mexican-American War and Civil War hero and fights in the white militia. Others of her sons become the Parnas, or president of Shearith Israel, and one of her sons ends up marrying the granddaughter of Gershom Mendes Seixas. And it's through that, through that line that Blanche is born. So really, they become mainstays of that New York Jewish community. And most of Sarah's descendants come through this marriage, though a couple of her other sons end up having illegitimate children as well, who have descendants who survive till today. One of the things that fascinated me as I was wrapping up this book was how incredibly mobile the next generation was as well, and how their mobility was really predicated on that mobility of the previous generation. So we see some of Sarah's sons involved living in China, involved in the trade there, some involved in the Civil War and the Mexican-American War, some off trying to make it rich in the gold rush, none of them do, some living along the Texas-Mexican border, and a couple of them even trying to overthrow the government in Nicaragua. So really involved in a lot of the major conflicts of the 19th century. And again, almost all of these predicated on that ability to be understood as white by the larger Jewish community as well as by the US government. So again, it's through that line with Lionel and Selena that Blanche, the woman who I began with, is born, as well as a couple of other children through her sons who are living along the border with Texas. So I think it's here that it's worth exploring, why was it then that Blanche had no idea about this history? Why did this lay buried until I started doing my research into the family story? And I think part of this really has to do with how race had changed by the time that Sarah had died, between then and the time when Blanche was writing her history. So one thing that obviously is important is that Sarah died quite young. And in fact, Blanche's father was only 3 when his mother passed away. So there wasn't as much time for that discussion. Yet we do know that that her father grew up in and around Isaac, who was going back and forth to Barbados as an adult, and who, when he was in Barbados as an adult, was still considered a gentleman of color. So why was it that Blanche couldn't understand that she could somehow both be Jewish and have African ancestry? And I think here, one of the answers lies in the context of what's going on in the 1920s through the 1940s. So by the 1920s, the understanding of race in the census and in the American society more generally has really changed. So unlike in the first part of the 19th century where it varied by state, it's consistent across the United States. And they've adopted something in the census similar to the way that race was understood in Barbados, that something that we would later call the one-drop rule, where if you had any African ancestors, you were automatically considered a person of color. And that meant that for Blanche to understand that her grandmother, somebody who she knew had been seen as white in New York, had been born enslaved, was to suddenly understand that actually, according to the laws of that time period, her grandmother was a person of color. But it also would have meant that Blanche would have had to understand herself as being a person of color too, because according to the local laws during the 1920s, Blanche also would have suddenly had to rethink her own racial identity. And that's something that Blanche never does. Blanche consistently marks herself as white on the census. But I want to emphasize too that there's a lot going on in New York that helps reinforce this divide in Blanche's mind. In spite of the fact that there are a large number of African American synagogues very close to where Blanche is living on the Upper West Side in Harlem, if you look at maps from this time period, you'll see that neighborhoods were marked out as being either Jewish, which was shown in red, or as being African American, which was shown in gray, as if somehow those two were inherently separate. So by this time period, we see this sort of way in which Blanche is being told by the larger society, either you're Jewish or you're a person of color, but there's no way that you could be both. Again, completely ignoring the fact that there are these large Jewish Black communities in Harlem at the time, including one led by Rabbi Ford, who was himself from Barbados and whose parents had grown up in Ann Jordan Gill's Methodist congregation, where there was movement back and forth to the synagogue. So again, very much part of this moment in history where forgetting is sort of required by the new racial identities of the time. So I want to stop there, and I'm hoping that people have some questions that they would like answered.
Thank you, Laura, so much. That was so interesting and fascinating, and I truly learned so much in that deep dive. Please feel free to ask questions into the Q&A, and I will just start, Laura, by asking, what surprised you the most as you were doing this research?
Yeah, really good question. So I would say one of the things that was most surprising to me is, and people who know me know that my previous book was on women in early New York through 5 objects. And so I really have been pretty immersed in women's history. And I tended to have this idea that like, oh, women, they're left out of history, they're oppressed. And so I sort of assumed that Sarah would have a much harder time becoming part of the Jewish community than Isaac. And that actually turned out not to be the case. And once I thought about it, I was like, I could totally see why, but it was very counterintuitive to me. So Sarah had a very easy, once she marries, she's very much accepted right away into the community, and there's not a lot of pushback. Whereas Isaac is constantly running up against people giving him grief. And I think it really does have to do with the fact that a lot is at stake in terms of Isaac's participation both in the Jewish community and in the larger US community as well later, because he's the person who can vote, whereas Sarah doesn't have any ability to vote anyway, right? So
Right.
whether she's a full member or not is completely irrelevant. So it was a sort of interesting twist of my normal logic of women have a harder time, to really see race is super important to that question as well.
And how did you first learn about Sarah Moses? How did you first come across this story?
So I had actually first started working on them because I was working on Isaac Lopez Brandon. That I had a friend who works on Barbadian history, and I was working on a much earlier time period. And he had mentioned that in the synagogue minutes, there was this gentleman who had gotten kicked out of the Barbados Synagogue because that's what was needed in order to allow the European Jews the right to vote, which didn't pan out for them anyway. So it was horrible strategy anyway. But I was sort of interesting, but not my time period. Cool. But then I was later working on a book where I was really looking at Jewish emancipation movements across the Atlantic world. And so I came back and went through all the synagogue minutes and was transcribing them, and suddenly became much more interested in Isaac, in part because I knew the miniature of Isaac. So this is where being obsessed with material culture, that it's I know who this guy is. This is somebody who ends up in New York, and we have this glorious portrait of him. And I said, and actually we have a portrait of his sister too. Is that a sister from the childhood? And again, this is where the fact that all the genealogies were wrong was super not helpful, because sort of well, do I trust what they say, or can I actually prove something different? So really, I would say that led me to trying to prove that the woman in the miniature is the same person who appeared in the records of Barbados about being manumitted. And that took about 5 years to track down the information about that. So it's a story of how long it takes to write a book.
You could write another book about that.
Yeah, a lot of detective work of going, each time I went to an archive, I'd look for something else. So yeah, so definitely I would say the miniatures played a key role, because obviously I'm interested in material culture and objects, but I do feel there's a way in which those miniatures, I don't know if people notice, but the people have big eyes in them. And that's part of the genre, is that they have these beautiful eyes that are meant to lure you in and make you feel this emotional attachment to the person. I feel that still works. Over 100 years later, we're still oh, who is this person? I want to know them.
I know them.
Yeah, exactly. And so I feel had there not been the portraits, I'm not sure I would have been quite as obsessed with them in the same sort of way, and been willing to spend all that time trying to track everything down.
Yeah, the imagery definitely speaks to you and invokes the need to learn more.
Totally.
I'm gonna take some questions from the audience. Sharon wants to know, did the fancy London Jewish family understand that their son was marrying not just a rich heiress, but someone once quarter Black?
Yeah, and so to be clear, probably, and this is not something I mentioned, so there's no way you'd know this, but probably Sarah is more than is less than 1/4 Black, because even her great grandmother is described as being multiracial. And so that suggests that even her grandmother was at least half white, if that makes sense. So in any case, complicated, but or great grandmother's at least half white. So yes, they did. The way that we know this is the very witnesses that are signing her marriage contract and are in the record books are mainstay people of the Barbados community, and it's in her marriage contract that she's a convert. So there's not really any, her father's Portuguese, she's a convert, she's from Barbados, like there's people from, no, there's no secrets going on here, if it makes any sense. That, again, this is where that Jewish part of the story is so important, because we really do have people from Bridgetown of very similar circumstances who are also have African ancestry, and are members of the Montefiore family, and they come back to England, but they just kind of meld into English society. Nobody knows who they are, right? So there's no discussion there. Really just not possible for Jews during this time period. The Jewish communities are so interconnected. There's so much mobility between them. It's not like you could go to a new place and just not be known by people.
Great. Well, we have a lot of questions. I'll take a couple more.
Sure.
Where did their father's money come from?
So their father's money mainly comes from the triangle trade. So, and by that I don't mean from running ships of enslaved people, but mainly from sugar. So he's a merchant.
Oh.
He owns, later in life, he owns a number of plantations that are sugar producing places, but he's also just sort of buying and selling various crops around the Atlantic world. This is very typical during this time period. It's very hard to be a merchant and not be involved in some way in the triangle trade. And that just means that, like, you're always selling byproducts that are dependent upon slavery during this time period. So ironically, his money comes from slavery, basically.
And then we also have a couple questions that are asking, how do members of the family think of the story today? Have you been able to talk to descendants of the family, and sort of what are their opinions and thoughts of the story?
Yeah, so that, great question. And I always feel like this is a good moment to like have a warning for people. I tracked down a number of the descendants, and some of the earliest ones I tracked down were descendants of Isaac. And I tracked them down because they had written to the archive in Barbados asking for information about their ancestors. And this is the warning: if you ever send anything to an archive, they will keep it. So they put the letter that he had sent into the folder, and then 30 years later I come to the island and look at the family's folder, and there's his letter in there too. So I suddenly knew the name of one of the descendants, and knew, and he had traced out in his letter how he was related. So I was able, fortunately he hadn't moved that much and he hadn't passed away, so I was able to track him down and met up with him. And I talk a little bit about this in the book. I was very trepidatious at first because I was like, oh, I have lots of interesting information. I have beautiful pictures. And he said, oh, let's meet up at the St. Nicholas Society downtown in New York. And I didn't know where that was, but St. Nicholas Society is something that's like for people with like fancy early New York ancestors. And we met in this building that was also housed like Daughters of the American Revolution and stuff like that. So I was like,
wow.
This may not go very well. He's looking for like my elite ancestors or whatever. So and not about slavery. And so I met up with him and he was so excited. So first of all, he was so excited about like the portraits and all the things that I had found that he didn't know about, but he was also so like touched by the story of Isaac and his role in the civil rights disputes and the larger family's role in civil rights disputes, because one of his sons was a civil rights lawyer. So he sort of felt like, oh, it all comes around and like there's this legacy in the family. So that I was like, so I've only had really positive experiences with the descendants, and more recently I've been in contact with some of Sarah's descendants as well. So
we have another question from Judah. If I remember correctly from your talk last year, you said it was considered she was marrying down when in London she married an Ashkenazi man. So if that was true, when they moved to his home in New York, why did they join the Portuguese Sephardic community instead of the Ashkenazi one?
Fantastic question. So yes, so when she marries Joshua Moses, his father had been the president of New York's Jewish community because it's very small, and he is a well-respected merchant. So he's sort of able in New York, unlike he would never have been able to be the Parnas or president in London of the Sephardic community, but he's able to be the president of Shearith Israel because it's a small community. They can't afford to be that picky. But they don't join the Ashkenazi one because there is no Ashkenazi synagogue during that time period in New York. The Ashkenazi synagogue is started not less than a decade after they come to New York, but really it's not an option for them because there is no Ashkenazi synagogue. I talk a little bit about it in the book, but it's really the Ashkenazi synagogue in some sense gets its start from the yellow fever pandemics. There's this split in the community about how to respond to the yellow fever pandemics, and the kind of renegade group that wants to be much more mystical breaks away and they become the Ashkenazi congregation. So that they don't have a choice, and they do not join that congregation. By that point, they are very much mainstays of Shearith Israel, and they stay there. And I would say also, like, it's very clear that the next generation clings to that Sephardic aspect of their identity that they get from the mother. So
yeah, that's really interesting. Well, I'm going to wrap it up by asking one last question: is what's next?
yeah, so thank you. So right now I have two things that are going on. One is a book that's coming out pretty soon that's co-edited with Adriana Brodsky that's called Jews Across the Americas, and it's a source book about Jews from Latin America and the Caribbean and North America, including Canada, from the colonial period to the present. So I hope people check that out. And then in addition, I'm working on a book on Jews and textiles in the 19th century. So just
Awesome.
one of those like labors of love where I'm like, what are the objects that I'm fascinated by? So it has stuff on a wedding dress that became a Torah mantle, on quilts, and about samplers and all sorts of things. So very interested in how the kinds of objects that people create through textiles allow them to, particularly women, to create some sort of agency over their identities and group activities of creating community during the 19th century.
I'm so excited to learn more about that and check it out. Well, thank you, Laura, again so much for joining us, and to everyone who was able to attend tonight. It was such a pleasure, and I myself learned so much, so I'm excited for everyone that's here tonight. It'll be up on our YouTube channel tomorrow. In the chat, you'll see some of our upcoming events that are coming up. We have a really fun Passover day of learning and exploration. So I hope, it's going to be great. So I hope to see you all there in person, not on Zoom. And thank you again so much.
Thank you so
Have a
much.
great night. Thank you.
Thanks for coming, everybody.